Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Horace M. Albright Lecture in Conservation. I'm Keith Gillis, Dean of the College of Natural Resources here at Berkeley and a professor of forest economics. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details. You know, what are deans good for? We can give housekeeping details, but don't look to us for intellectual guidance. The free speech movement was born here at Berkeley, and we hope you, well, let's not laugh about that. It's serious. And a lot of us really treasure that tradition, including those of us in administration. We hope you'll honor that tradition by allowing all the audience members to fully and civilly engage at this time. We'll ask you to please allow our speakers and your fellow audience members to enjoy today's program without interruption. And of course, today's program is not the program that was passed out at the door. We have a great program that dozens of Berkeley faculty, staff, students, alumni, and people that are interested in the future of parks in America have worked very hard for the last year to put on. So let's keep in our seats, and please, shouting and events that disrupt the event or prevents the speakers from being heard, that's actually not free speech, at least in my book. So people that engage in those kinds of actions may be asked to leave. Police could intervene if necessary, and people could face student conduct sanctions. Okay, housekeeping done. There'll be a time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. I'll sit here with my assistant dean, and we'll try and get good examples of questions. We don't screen the content of the questions. We just try and get good exemplars, and we'll pass them up to the moderator tonight. Please take a moment and, turn them off. Technology isn't great when it's loud. Please, no photography tonight. The whole thing will be photographed. And I was at a talk recently where people were videoing on cameras in front of me, and because of my eyesight problems in the dark, I basically couldn't see the screen because of the glare from the cell phone. So let's respect that. Okay, on to the good stuff. The Horace Albright Lecture Series at the College of Natural Resources has been going strong for over 50 years. And it's a wonderful tribute to the life of Horace Albright and his many achievements. We're really honored to have the opportunity to have this endowed lecture series to continue the public discourse on critical issues facing our society with respect to conservation and sustainability. Through the lecture series, we have brought to the campus a veritable who's who of the world's thought leaders in these areas, and I think the conversation you're going to hear tonight aligns absolutely perfectly with the spirit and traditions of the series. But before we get to our distinguished panel of speakers, I'd like to introduce UC Berkeley Chancellor Nicholas Dirks, who's going to set the stage for the discussion to follow. Chancellor Dirks.
Thank you very much. Good evening. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you tonight to what is surely one of the most special of them all of the Albright Lectures since the series was established in 1959. It is appropriate that it is a special lecture tonight, since it was exactly 100 years ago, in March of 1915, that Berkeley alumni Horace M. Albright and his mentor, Stephen T. Mather, brought together on this campus the leading scientists, conservationists, and park leaders of their day to lay the foundation for what would become America's national parks system. An idea that has had such an enormous lasting impact on the fundamental relationship in this country between humanity and the natural world. This week, as most of you are aware, we've been hosting a modern-day corollary to Mather and Albright's historic conference. The summit now underway is called Science for the Parks, Parks for Science, the Next Century. And one of the most important events being held to celebrate the National Park Service's centennial is this event. Now, once again, leading scientists, conservationists, policymakers, and park managers have come to this university, bound together by deep belief in and commitment to the preservation of our parks, and the extraordinary, if often underappreciated, contribution they make. They make these contributions not just to our well-being as a nation that has a love of our extraordinary and varied outdoor spaces and their spectacular beauty, but as the best possible laboratory for understanding how our natural world works, how our ecology is not only a complex and interconnected system, but one that is undergoing rapid and possibly devastating changes. Now more than ever, as the looming threats of climate change become ever more tangible, the work that goes on at the nexus of our nation's research institutions and the national parks has never been more important. It was the historian and novelist Wallace Stegner who said that our national parks are absolutely American, absolutely democratic, and that they reflect us at our best rather than our worst. And while I'm admittedly an interested party, I'm convinced that we can and must say the very same thing about our system of public higher education, another idea that embodies a deeply American understanding of and belief in the public good. It is surely no coincidence that President Abraham Lincoln played a particularly important role in the establishment of our pioneering systems of national parks, as well as public higher education. It was in 1862 that he signed the Morrill Act, legislation that was promoted by supporters as a matter of public justice and led to the establishment of land-grant universities across the country. And then, in 1864, Lincoln signed legislation deeding Yosemite Valley to the state of California, the initial step towards the establishment of a national system of parks. The Yosemite Grant was the first land grant to protect wildlands for the enjoyment of all people, not just of the country, not just of California, but of the world. And at the heart of both the higher education and park systems is the provision of the most precious of public resources, land, to be used in support of the public interest. It's worth reflecting this evening about what these two great ideas say, or at least said, about who we are as a people and what we are as a nation. Inherent in both is a disdain for the notion of inherited privilege and a commitment to equality of opportunity without regard for socioeconomic status, the opportunity to learn and explore, to engage fully in our physical and intellectual surroundings, to have free and unfettered access to the best of this country's human and natural resources. But dig down a little deeper and you'll find there at the foundation of our national parks and public universities ties that bind them together in an even more fundamental fashion. A basic belief in the notion of a public good and the need for robust, equitable public institutions to safeguard and support that greater good for posterity, for, by, and of the people, as Lincoln so eloquently put it. Today, as our panelists prepare to explore these two great ideas, we begin by acknowledging that their future is by no means secure. There is growing evidence that the very idea of the public and the public good is in serious trouble. We live in an age of political paralysis, with a palpable decline in our confidence that government, and by extension and implication other public entities, are worthy of our full support. Funding for scientific research is in decline. More states across the country are disinvesting in public higher education. According to the National Parks Conservation Association, the National Park Service, which has been long struggling with budgetary issues, has been crippled by compounded budget cuts over recent years. The same threats exist around our extraordinary system of public higher education. We're being told that excellence in research and teaching is an extravagance that only the private sector, and by implication the privileged elite, should have access to. That equality of opportunity should give way to the same private interests that threatened the natural inheritance that earlier generations sought to reserve for all of our use and all of our experience of what this nation might mean. So this evening, as we become or rather in these days, as we become again so preoccupied with presidential politics and national campaigns, I hope we can remember that the idea of a public good is enshrined in these two great ideas, that our democracy, our belief in opportunity and the need for socioeconomic and cultural betterment, our commitment to learning in the service of humanity and our shared social goals, the sense that the American dream is for all who come to these shores from all over the world and from every possible background, will depend upon our success in remembering and restoring the belief we share about the importance of what we celebrate this evening. Thank you very much.
May I have 1 minute on the mic, please? 1 minute.
1 minute.
1 minute, thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Lauren Butler, and I'm a fourth year here at Berkeley, actually majoring in conservation and resource studies in the College of Natural Resources. I'm thrilled that Chancellor Dirks and President Napolitano are here to speak about their commitment to public education in public lands. I'm actually here today to ask our Chancellor whether or not he's going to extend that commitment to the community of Richmond, where he plans to build the Berkeley Global Campus. Richmond is one of the most disadvantaged communities in all of California, where 83% of residents are people of color, unemployment and poverty far exceed state averages, and the environmental and health consequences of past industrial exploitation continues to this day. We have asked Chancellor Dirks to sign a binding community benefits agreement that will, 1, ensure campus jobs are living wage UC jobs, not poverty jobs with private firms that exploit workers of color. 2, this agreement will help longtime Richmond residents displaced from their homes by developing alternative housing instead of pushing them out of their homes and further into poverty. And 3,
We're here, so.
agreement, Chancellor Dirks. If anyone would like more information on the privatization of public land, please take a look at the program that was handed to you all.
Okay, thanks. We're at 2 minutes, so. Sure. I think the Chancellor will answer at a time of his choosing. We've given you 2 minutes of podium time out of respect. Thank you. Okay. It's interesting, I chair the state's regulatory board for forestry and fire protection, so I'm used to giving a limited podium time, but saying that's it, and so that's it. But everyone does get heard. All right, so it's my distinct honor this evening to introduce our panelists who will have a conversation about America's 2 best ideas, public education and public lands, as outlined by the Chancellor. And I'd like to ask my panelists to come forward and take their seats at this point. Sally Jewell. Sally, if you'd raise your hand. Sally is United States Secretary of the Interior. As the Secretary of Interior, Sally Jewell leads an agency with 70,000 employees and is responsible for stewardship of 20% of our nation's land. Janet Napolitano, seated next. Janet is president of the UC system, comprised of 10 campuses, 5 medical centers, 3 affiliated national laboratories, and a statewide agricultural and natural resource program, of which my college is a proud component. Douglas Brinkley. Douglas is a New York Times best-selling author and professor of history at Rice University, as well as a fellow at the James Baker Institute for Public Policy. Finally, I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening. Many of you in our audience are quite familiar with the distinguished voice of the on-air host of the very popular KQED Forum program, Michael Krasny. I'd like to thank all of you for being with us, and Michael, I will now put the program in your capable hands.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure, a privilege, and an honor to be here with this distinguished panel. This face does go with the voice you're hearing, by the way, in case there's any confusion about that. I'd also like to say that what we're talking about has been billed as America's two best ideas, public education and public lands. If we could add a third, maybe public radio would be perhaps But I really am sincere about being delighted to be here, and I think what you'll hear tonight will be rich, and I'm looking forward to not only hearing from all of our participants, but also hearing from you, the way we do on the radio program. After presentations for about 2 or 3 minutes by each of our panelists, our distinguished panelists, we'll have an opportunity for me to engage them in conversation, and then for you to ask questions. The easiest way to bring questions forward would be simply to write them on cards that will be distributed to you, and we'll obviously try to get to as many as we can, time permitting. But first we're going to hear from Secretary Jewell, and Sally Jewell will be talking to you, I'm sure, about a big initiative that's underway, and certainly will have a great deal to say about these two treasures that we want to cherish and that we want to promote, the public universities and the public parks. Sally?
Well, thank you, Michael. And actually, that's not what I was going to talk about. It is great to be back in Berkeley. It's great to be back here for the Horace Albright lecture. I was here in my old day job, and it's a great forum, so thank you. Thank you, Berkeley, really, for nurturing the spirit that led to the national park system. It is one of the reasons that we have the national parks, and it is in many ways America's best idea, and I agree that public education is as well. And I thought what I'd do, because we've just got a couple of minutes, is just tell you about my own experience, about the intersection of those two things. I'm an immigrant to the United States, and my father came before the rest of the family by a few months, and he went to his colleagues at the University of Washington Medical School, where he was doing a fellowship, and he said, "What do people do around here?" And they said, "Well, you hike and you camp." This is in Seattle. And he said, "Oh, well, how do you do that?" And they said, "You go down to this little store called REI." So my father joined for $2, member number 17249. Berkeley is the second REI store. But my point is that my first experiences were actually Carbon River and Mount Rainier National Park, in the outdoors and nature, other than the little parks that I went to. And when I was, as a child in England, and when I was about 9, 10, and 11. I was telling Dr. E.O. Wilson this in a quick chat I had with him today. I went on these 2-week campouts. They were Olympic National Park. They were what has now become San Juan Island's National Monument. They were in and around Mount Rainier National Park, and they were with graduate students from public universities, in this case the University of Washington. They could only stand the kids for a week apiece, but I learned about marine biology. On the trip to the San Juan Islands. We created a camp. We had a marine biologist with us for a week, and then we had a topographical mapper, and we mapped out the topography of the lands and the Indian graves, which may or may not have been accurate, but we were convinced that they were. We boiled kelp, tried to candy it. I hiked across the Olympic Peninsula when I was 11 with graduate students again, and I just thought that to tee this up, there was no better way for me to sort of say what's the intersection of public education and public lands than to recount my old childhood and say that our best classrooms are the ones with no walls. They're the ones where kids can be kids, and they can explore their creativity and their curiosity, and they can get that love of learning that will never leave them if you catch them at the right time. So that is a big part of what we are doing as we look to the second century of the National Park Service, as Berkeley celebrates 100 years of America's best idea, as really in many ways the birthplace of the National Park Service. So we are launching an initiative that will start actually in the fall called Every Kid in a Park, which will be a free pass to all 4th graders and their families to go to national parks. We are doing an effort to raise money from the private sector to get every kid in a park, whether it's a local park, a national park, or all public lands in between, state parks and so on. Because it starts with that neighborhood lot, like the one I saw with some young people in the National Park Service today in Richmond, actually. I was out with Rosie the Riveters and looking at the facility out there and meeting the Rosies again. But also seeing how young people in that community are interacting with the Park Service and turning lands along a new greenway into welcoming spaces, both for the neighborhoods and for people that cycle through. So it's a good illustration of what we're all about as we make the national parks relevant in the next generation, and as we engage a lot more young people. So it's not just kids like me that had amazingly fortunate experiences. It is all children. And the parks are relevant for all children, and they become the best idea, not looking in the rearview mirror, but looking to the future.
Thank you, Sally. Jewell. Since I brought up the initiative, I just have to ask, how many children do you estimate will be involved?
Well, just in the Title I kids alone, is it 10 million, John? 10 million, 4 million, 4 million just in the free and reduced price lunch children in the country.
Yeah.
So, probably triple, quadruple that number. That's just fourth graders. We'd like every kid in the park, so you can do your part. Take them by the hand, take them out there. But fourth grade, every year for 12 years, you've got every kid in the park for that generation. And this is a program that we are confident with the right kind of support we can sustain for the long term.
And now we have the opportunity to hear from UC President Janet Napolitano, former governor of Arizona, former head of Homeland Security. And I was kidding her saying this may be the toughest job of them all, but please. President Napolitano.
Well, thanks. And when we think of great ideas that have propelled the United States historically, and that are distinguishing characteristics of the United States, one is this terrific access to nature and the kind of value we put on having experiences out in nature, from fourth graders up to those who are celebrating the centennial of Rosie the Riveter. So that's one great idea, really hatched at the beginning of the 20th century. But the second one, and the one that makes me so excited about my current role, is the notion of having public higher education at the highest possible level, where research is done and new knowledge is created, knowledge that helps inform what happens in the parks and the protection of the ecosystems of the parks, but also the transmission of that knowledge, and provides in and of itself a way to have opportunity for all, to have social mobility, or at least the access to social mobility. And that was really an idea that came to fruition in the mid-19th century with the Morrill Act and the land-grant universities, of which we are one, with Berkeley and Davis and Riverside being our three land-grant campuses, but all of our campuses having work in this area, plus the Ag and Natural Resources Division, which puts us into cooperative extension in every county in California, plus the Natural Reserve System that is part of the University of California, the largest natural reserve system in the United States. So you've got natural reserve, you've got cooperative extension, you've got the land-grant universities, and you've got this huge idea underlying it all about public higher education. And when you think about what makes California, California, there are so many things that can go into that formula, into that recipe. But in my view, the secret sauce is really the notion that not only are you going to have public universities, but you're going to have public research universities that compete all the time with the best universities in the world, be they private or public. And that is a very, very important characteristic of the United States as we moved from the 19th century to the early 20th century. And now our challenge is, where do we go from here?
Good. Thank you. We'll go to Professor Brinkley next.
Well, I grew up in Ohio. My mom and dad were high school teachers. I didn't have a lot of money to go to college, so I went to Ohio State because it was our state public university. And I decided to be a historian. And my parents said we had a 24-foot Coachman trailer, and I spent my whole childhood getting to go all over America and visiting Mammoth Cave and Big Bend and Yellowstone and Yosemite. It's what my fondest memories. Now that I have 3 little kids, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, and an 11-year-old, we're taking them all the national parks and trying to get our passports stamped and the like. And it's not just America's great idea, it's an essential idea. And I'm writing a book on Franklin Roosevelt right now called Rightful Heritage, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Land of America. And Horace Albright plays a seminal role in the narrative I'm writing because the Bay Area here has developed some of the best environmental thinkers in world history, and mainly John Muir and David Brower and others. And Horace Albright deserves to be considered in that same ilk. And the little story I wanted to tell you in my few minutes on the book I'm writing is Horace Albright had the long career running the National Park Service. But here Franklin Roosevelt gets sworn in, and as you all know, the famous, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. You know, the big 100 days of the New Deal with, a quarter of the country unemployed. And not only does he create the Civilian Conservation Corps, FDR, and ends up planting 3 billion trees, 3 billion trees Franklin Roosevelt planted with the CCC, unemployed work relief workers going all over, including all over California. But right when FDR's, after his inaugural, he took a Sunday drive with Horace Albright to Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. And at that point, in a conversation with Albright, FDR decided to take all of the national monuments, war cemeteries, historic sites, including our National Mall and the White House and the like, and take them out of the agricultural department, take them out of the war department, and put them into Interior. That was Albright. The modern Interior Department of today was really the conceptual work of FDR and Horace Albright. It was such a raid on ag and that at that point, Albright said, "Goodbye, I'm quitting now. I'm not going to be in the line of fire." But he loved the American outdoors like nobody's business. And the parks that I've been visiting and writing about with my book on Franklin Roosevelt are places like Big Bend in Texas. Do you realize that FDR wanted to make that an international park with Mexico, creating a whole new paradigm of how countries can do almost what we'd call environmental diplomacy today? And do you realize that Big Bend was the deed went to our national park on June 6, 1944? That he didn't cancel the meetings on D-Day, FDR, when Amon Carter from Fort Worth, Texas, came with the land deed from Texas, and Big Bend joins the National Park Service. He went up to your state secretary, and this is one of the great Interior secretaries. It's like an honor to be here with you, truly. But he went up, FDR went up to Oregon, and then up to Washington and went to the Olympics, and people were debating what to do with the Olympics, and he went and saw people that had clear cut and left just rotting fields, and FDR, who of course couldn't walk, was incapacitated, looked out and said within earshot of everybody, "Whoever ruined this landscape should rot in hell." This is the President of the United States. And he went forward to create Olympics National Park. In California, in Joshua Tree, which I love, it's one of my favorites. But a woman named Ravana Hamilton Hoyt from South Pasadena created the International Desert Conservation League. People thought deserts were wastelands. And Ravana Hoyt created a league and lobbied, and eventually she got a meeting with FDR, and he basically said, "I'll declare it a national monument." And she wanted 1 million acres. She got 700,000 at that point acres, and hence it's the beginning of this whole desert protection. So I'd like to let you know, when you're thinking about national parks, it's just not just the big parks. I go to Yellowstone, I go to Yosemite, but all these amazing cultural and historic sites. And also that there's just a lot of great predecessors, people that did all this work that we can be at this point and come back here to Berkeley and recognize this as to be a marker out in front. I mean, the birthplace of the idea of the modern national park system here at your Berkeley campus, and it's just another feather in the cap to the Bay Area, who's done so much, not just for America, but for the planet, the idea of the national parks out of Berkeley. And I hope Berkeley today continues to be leading on climate, because I think you're the climate change vortex of ideas and energy, and that urgent problem, we need to keep it going. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for your thoughtful, and I may add, inspiring speeches, making it personal, making it historical, and making it celebrative of these two great institutions that we all hallow. I'm speaking also as a public university professor for many years, and someone who's going to Yosemite in a few weeks hence. Just wondering, though, I have three really fine minds here together, and three people who obviously love and are committed to the future of the parks. Let's put our heads together and initially see what we can think about in terms of preserving and ensuring, and also the future. President Napolitano mentioned not only public education, but the public parks. We're seeing them together in a kind of symmetry here, and what I'd like to find out from each of you, perhaps, is what your thoughts are in terms of public policy and also really kind of a grassroots support. I mean, there are many people who give lip service and love the parks and love the universities and cherish them, but there are revenue problems now. In California, obviously, we've got some serious revenue problems for the support of the public universities. We have a Republican legislature. I don't want to necessarily get into the minefields of politics, but there are many who feel that they're not necessarily the closest ally or the most amenable ally to the kinds of things we're talking about here. So can I ask each of you where you would like to see the future, how you would like to see the future ensured? Could I begin with you, Janet Napolitano?
I am the Lorax. I speak for the trees. I speak for the trees where the trees have no tongues. And I'm asking you all at the top of my lungs, if you care about public lands and think
Now, if I could extend the platform to you, President Napolitano.
Thank you. I think that when we talk about these big public institutions, what I've seen and have felt happening over the last several decades is this kind of almost diminishment in public importance in the sense of an understanding or of a commonwealth, of the willingness of people to say, you know what, I will pay my taxes. I don't want to pay more than my fair share, but I'll pay my fair share. And one of the things I want to make sure happens with my tax dollars is that we protect the lands of the United States, the great parks that we have. Be they Big Bend, be they Yosemite, be they all other kinds of sites, and that my children will have the ability to get a great public education. And so I hope that as we're moving forward, we're really talking with the public and re-engaging the public about how the public views it's our collective future. What do we want to build? What do we want to leave behind to the next generation? How do we prevent the further diminution of what it is that we inherited? Those, I think we're all probably roughly the same age. What we had as we were growing up, as we were kids, as we were students. We've seen now a divide, and that divide takes many forms, and it has many symptoms. But to me, if we're truly going to talk about a national park system and not only protect the parks we have, but add other ones and new ones and different types of ones, and if we're not only going to keep our public universities, but grow them so that they thrive and that even more young people have the opportunity to attend a university like the University of California, somehow that public debate and that public engagement has to become much more robust. And it has to be more robust, not just at the public meeting level, but in the halls of the Congress and of the state legislatures and of the city councils and townships of the country.
Sally Jewell, let me ask you to pick up there because, first of all, would you agree with President Napolitano we're seeing a diminution of really support for the kind of institutions we're talking about here that we hold so hallowed, really?
I think there's no question about it. I like to say that, you know, for really the last maybe 30 years, we have been pulling back from the good of the commons in favor of the good of the individual. And we see that in the institutions that my parents built and grandparents built in terms of roads and universities and libraries and public schools and parks and infrastructure, and it's everything. You're having to hold a bake sale for everything. I didn't think I'd be jumping into fundraising other than begging for money from Congress when I got in this job, but I realized early on that if we wanted to do what we aspired to do in terms of connecting the next generation, I was going to have to tap the private sector to see if they would help us, and they have been. I would say, though, to your question, how do we change this in the future? How do we get back to the good of the commons? And it starts with really helping our children, our grandchildren, understand the benefit of the commons, and I think that we can do that by connecting kids to public lands, connecting kids to nature. I had the privilege of spending a half an hour with E.O. Wilson just earlier this evening, and of course he's the father of the BioBlitz. I think about BioBlitzes, I think about citizen science, I think about how technology has enabled us to spend 56 hours a week in front of a screen if we're a child, and only 30 minutes a week playing outside, which is a huge problem, and I think we as parents have to deal with that. We as educators have to deal with that. Let's start by bringing back recess. And as parents, let's let kids play. Let's kids play. But I think that we have to make sure that we are growing and looking to the future, making sure that our parks, our public lands, our institutions are relevant to new and emerging generations. And we want to make sure that we...
Something to say, wait till you have an opportunity to say it. Nobody called on you. You interrupted the Secretary of the Interior. It was discourteous. Stay seated. Shut your mouth. I'm sorry, Secretary. Yeah.
It's always I just want to say that I think it's up to all of us to turn the tide, to re-examine the commons and the good of the commons, to make sure that a future generation of elected officials cares about the things that have shaped us as a nation. Our public lands, our public universities, our public schools, our public spaces in all respects. And it's up to us to nurture that. It's up to us to make sure that our elected officials know. And I will tell you that as a newcomer into politics, the phrase all politics is local really makes sense to me now. Your voices matter. How you speak as constituents at every level of government matters. And when your elected officials know how you feel and what is important to you, that is when we will see real change. So I want to change it from the bottom up with our youth, but we all have a role in this in this democracy. So I would just urge your
Forgive me, you're talking about citizenship, and you're also talking about parental role, and you're talking about the responsibility that goes to the next generation.
Correct.
Yeah. Doug, could you pick up there?
Well, in general, we just, one thing we can all do is join the friends groups of national parks. Each of them have groups that kind of contribute to how to protect a particular one. So if you have one that you like, join it. Others is to fight for new ones, and not just national parks, but national monuments, new national wildlife refuges. Secretary of Interior Jewell, for example, mentioned the San Juan Islands, and that was one of President Obama's national monuments up in Washington State. I'm very keen on Utah Canyonlands, and can we have a larger, around Canyonlands National Park, a Canyonlands National Monument? Can you do larger protection around the Grand Canyon in Arizona? In Maine right now, the Northwoods of Maine, can we get a new national park or national monument there in time for 16? We have an opportunity in 2016 to make America recognize in a new way the National Park Service, use history to say, God, this is 100 years of a success, but the public lands are shrinking. There's going to be development on them, so we've got to go and fight for those last parts of wild America and wilderness areas to try to continue to protect. And I just want to, I'm hoping that the idea of us being here tonight, it just gets us excited for the centennial of the National Park Service. This is the launch here. And it doesn't get any better than having somebody as busy as the Secretary of Interior coming and caring about the history to come to Berkeley and launch this. And now we've got a rollout to try to get people in America to start appreciating it. And the phrase that we've been talking about is nature deficit disorder, how people don't know what type of tree is in their backyard or what kind of species lives there. We have, it's easy to talk about the Park Service. Some of the finest people I know are the rangers and people that work on the ground and superintendents of these places, because it's not just about places being pretty. There's just complications in the parks of invasive species, of vandalism, of climate, of drought issues. It's just a backlog. And unfortunately, Congress is really a truly know-nothing, do-nothing Congress right now. And on pushing for these issues at a time when we need it. So we've got to create the grassroots swell, and I think the coming year in the national parks.
So Michael, so this is where universities also, this is a great example of where partnership can really matter, where the research and the science in a unity of effort with those who are managing the public lands can go together, and where student experiences can be married with that as well. UC Merced, our newest campus, for example, near the entrance to Yosemite National Park, has wonderful programs now for its students in the park. It's land management, it's water, it's public lands planning, it's all of those things together. And actually, it got direct hire authority from the Department of Interior, so that the park there can actually direct hire Merced students to be rangers, as opposed to going through the entire civil service process. And when I was DHS secretary, I could never get direct hire authority for anybody, for anything. So when I heard that this summer, I was going, yes, this is great. But it's an example of how these things really do go well together.
You know, it's almost as if you're telepathic, because the next place I was going to go for the expertise of the three of you was, we talk a lot about town and gown, but what about these two institutions and marrying them essentially together so that there can be more of a symbiotic relationship?
Well, I'll jump in just with a story that I think our director of the Fish and Wildlife Service was telling me the other day, but John Jarvis will correct me if it was him. He talked about a researcher here in California that did incredibly detailed field studies in the High Sierra, where over 100 years ago. And his notes were so detailed. Was it you, John? You're telling me this? Sorry. Joseph Purnell, thank you. Where was it?
Well, it was a Berkeley professor.
But it was up in the Sierra, yeah. So in the High Sierra, where he took such detailed notes, you can actually go back to these sites today, find the sites where he camped, do the same kind of analysis and realize, as John was telling me, that you can see that the animals actually have moved upslope with climate change. And of course, we're seeing this, the pika, for example, a little species that is going to run out of space to go because it'll be in the rocky alpine environment with nothing to eat in not that many years. But because of that university research done 100 years ago and the meticulous way they did that, we now have really a 100-year history that you could never get in sort of the space of a single researcher. And that's a good illustration. And with the kind of technical tools that we have now, between the researchers who are on the cutting edge and the people on the ground that can help bring their knowledge, and I might say our nation's first people, our Indian tribes, across the entire nation who have traditional ecological knowledge that goes back thousands of years, you can blend these things to actually really do a much better job of understanding what's happening to our ecosystems, what it means for us, and where we can invest our resources, our human capital, to addressing those threats, as well as the adaptation that is very real for us right now.
Douglas Brinkley, somebody mentioned the commons before, and I wonder about how we inculcate more citizenship tied up to the notion of the commons and the common good.
A couple things. One thing that occurred in the 1920s, the big deal in conservation history was when the Adirondacks got saved, the forever Adirondacks. But by the 1920s, people were starting to look for state park systems. And it's actually in the Great Depression that the state park systems get built in the 1930s by the National Park Service. And the fuel for the state park movement was the land grant colleges. And it's not just for national parks, but for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. States like Iowa's, for example, with where you had Ding Darling and these people working directly with land grant universities in America, finding ways to start saving and doing preservation work and connecting it to recreation for the citizens. So the history is deep between the connection between universities like University of California, Berkeley, and the idea of preservation and land rehabilitation and reforestation and soil conservation. And the number, when you go by the building here where the dean's at for the Center for Natural Resources, but that was often an agricultural study building and the thoughts of forestry, but so many bright minds have come out of this university system that went on to kind of repair a lot of the land of America. On the bigger issue of commons, the one comment I'd like to make is I'm very interested in, some people talk about a huge commons in the heartland, a Buffalo Commons, but what can we do to reclaim some of our prairie land? And what can we do to do tall grass prairies? There's still the opportunities, as the heckler was referring, can you take some of the BLM land and make it into something that's more preservation oriented? That appeals to me a lot. Can we find more wilderness areas left in the United States? And do you know Ronald Reagan had signed like 50 wilderness acts? Reagan. And there's no way they can't now. The Congress is just so we can't get it done, and so we have to ask President Obama to pick up the executive, his pen, and create national monuments. And he's not afraid to do one. You might see one in Waco, woolly mammoth in Texas soon. You might see one in Boulder White Clouds in Idaho soon. So there's a fight going on to save the public lands protected, and I hope all of you here, I know a bunch of you are already involved, but if there's students here that aren't, join the cause. It's a great one. It's what's America without our public lands and our common space? A lot of fast food junctions. It's the beauty of America is really about the land. If you love America, you've got to love the land of America.
How many of you feel that resonates? I mean, that idea of the support of public lands, yeah. And I'm sorry, it's the old literature professor in me, but how do we, again, I'm thinking about inculcating the beauty of nature. A lot of you have been talking about, the outdoors and the aesthetics and the sense of just absorbing the experience of being in this classroom without walls, as you called it, Secretary Jewell. The universities do have that responsibility in part, don't they? I mean, this is what a liberal education at least used to be about, and now are we facing a kind of, I'll ask you, Janet Napolitano, are we facing a kind of opposition in some ways? Young people thinking, well, you know, I've got to learn how to code. I don't necessarily have to read Wordsworth anymore because I want to get a job coding. I'm obviously presenting it in a kind of polarized fashion, but it sometimes does seem to get down to that level for many students.
Yeah, I think you can code and read Wordsworth. I don't know that you'd have to pick.
They're not mutually exclusive, thank heavens. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing we could talk about a little bit is how we broaden the basis, how we broaden the population that actually gets to go to a national park. I mean, not everyone can grow up in a family where their parents have the wherewithal to take them around in a Winnebago or to let you go backpacking in the summer across the Olympic Peninsula. And I think actually some of the most valuable things we can do is help bring young children from households that may have had no prior experience with the lands and with that outdoor experience, and get them outdoors and let them experience that for themselves. You can't read about it and only read about it and appreciate it. It is really an experiential learning experience.
And there are organizations, of course, that do that. There aren't enough of them, in my
Not
judgment.
enough,
No,
because, and you see it when you go to a national park in terms of who's actually there, you know, the demography, the age group, and the like, and maybe the secretary could talk a little bit about that, but, you know, kind of broadening the basis of those who are actually going into the parks.
So that's why I gave you that lead to talk about the initiative, because that's what it's doing, really,
Yeah.
isn't it? Yeah.
I figured we'd get to it in the course of this. So we have a youth initiative, and it's really about a continuum that is play, learn, serve, and work. Just a week and a half ago, with the support of a corporate contribution, in this case American Express, we launched a 50 cities initiative, fanned out across the country, announced the first 11 cities where we're working with YMCAs. YMCAs serve 9 million children through their membership. They're the largest daycare provider in the United States. And they connect with kids, but most of the programming is indoor. And so they would like to be part of the solution here. We are going to be putting through the grant from American Express a full-time staff person to coordinate with different organizations in the community to connect kids with nature. And we've picked cities that want to be partners with us, along with cities where we have some national assets, national parks, fish and wildlife refuges, other public lands. And the launch went really, really well. So I was in Miami, and I was with the mayor of Miami and near Biscayne National Park, and we were with a group of kids, and we were dissecting lionfish. Lionfish are an invasive species that is wiping out many of the fish species along the coral reefs and bays around Miami. And I mean, kids dissecting a fish, cutting it up, squeezing out the contents of its stomach. I mean, what could be more exciting? I was very excited to be with it. So we did that. We were at Martin Luther King Jr. National Historic Site in Atlanta, where we have a historic site that honors the life and legacy of Dr. King. And we were there with a group of kids and an adjacent park where the city had put in playground equipment so that would draw the kids into the park. We were planting roses with young kids in the park that aligned actually with the gravesite of Dr. and Mrs. King, with a new rose, the Coretta Scott King rose, that aligned perfectly with the flame. We were in New York, in Battery Park, Castle Clinton, which is another national park site, in Battery Park, which is a New York State park, with the Battery Conservancy, where they have planted native plants, doing a service project there. I mean, there are tons of opportunities and a lot of excitement. It just needs a bit of organization. So with a private grant, with our own resources, with a partnership with the YMCA, and with cities, we're doing this, replicating it around 50 cities in the country. So that's how you do it. I mean, just roll up your sleeves, you get organized, and you make it happen. And you steer your resources, as we have in the Department of Interior, to say, can we get part of our deferred maintenance done using Youth Conservation Corps crews? We can't do what FDR did in this day and age. Congress would never say, let's write a check from the federal government to do this. But what he did through the CCC changed the lives of millions of men in this country, including segregated but equal national park sites, Prince William Forest Park and Catoctin Mountain Park, both places I go now to get some outdoors in D.C., that had separate facilities, but they were built, believe it or not, to engage children of the Great Depression in nature. And they were built by men, black and white, separate but equal, and pretty much identical camps that teaches a bit of history while also connecting kids there. So we want to do that again, but we're doing it with Youth Conservation Corps crews, with volunteers from the community, and with generous donations from a number of foundations and private.
With these kind of partnerships, and really your enthusiasm is infectious, moving forward, I have to ask you, Janet Napolitano, if you foresee similar kinds of analogies with respect to affordability for the university and the UC system. I mean, young people who clearly don't necessarily have the opportunity economically, do you see things moving in a trajectory that will lead for more opportunity?
In terms of, I think, yeah.
The President is answering a question I asked. I'd like you to please give her, afford her the courtesy.
I was just thinking about, you know, the Depression, Franklin Roosevelt, and still found time to found the CCC. The land-grant universities, well, that's an idea that Abraham Lincoln was able to get to even in the midst of, you know, getting the run-up to the Civil War. So, I mean, you know, great leaders can do great things and they can multitask. And great universities can multitask. And great universities can multitask where research. Great universities can multitask in terms of the partners that it has. Great universities can be thinking about not just now, but pay it forward for the next generation. All kinds of ways to do it. And great public universities can do ever more of that with the right amount of public investment in those schools.
I've got some questions from you in the audience. Feel free to send them forward on cards, and I'll go to them now. And let me go to this first one with you, if I may, Professor Brinkley. Many of our public lands include cultural resources that are tangible reminders of our past and illuminate our progress. We have shaped our public lands by preserving them, transforming them into cultural landscapes. Can you discuss the relationship between natural and cultural resources?
Oh, it's a wonderful question, and just think she was just mentioning the CCC being the boys. Eleanor Roosevelt tried to have she camps. It didn't go too far. She got a few of them off and running. But now look at how we earlier a little bit ago met a woman who's in her 90s that's been overseeing and working with the Rosie the Riveter here, celebrating women of World War II. President Obama had signed an executive order a few years ago saving La Paz, Cesar Chavez's burial site and home here in California. Just weeks ago, Pullman, the famous Pullman strike, labor strike, saved in Chicago. The National Park Service is constantly adding units and ideas and opening up the net of our history all the time. And in our cultural resources, what we're doing, I'm down in Austin, Texas is where I live, and you could see what's being preserved, Latino heritage, the old missions of San Antonio, the efforts of not just the cultural aspects of Native American culture being saved at obvious places, Mesa Verde and the like, but just I think across the country, the excitement of people of learning that our history is not just white man history, that it's this deep other ways to look at things. And we have pioneers here at Berkeley in the ecofeminism starting in the 70s and 80s, which have been so important. So I feel at the centennial, if you look at the progress we've made, there's just all sorts of things. Anything. I spoke last night in D.C. and a guy I met's trying to save Stonewall in New York City to have the National Gay History Museum there. And all these things are now possible with some imagination. And so the parks, although we always think of Yellowstone, Yosemite, the big parks, it's also about our cultural identity in America.
Let me follow that up with you, Doug, with another question from the audience. What do you see, because you spoke before the Commons, as the forces pushing the good of the individual over the good of the commons, and how can we overcome this? Our politicians aren't willing.
Well, I think it's just all a fight. I mean, conservation is fighting all the time. You take a big step forward and you get whacked back. It never ends. And look, everything. I walking here today from my hotel. I stopped at the David Brower Center that was on my way, and looking around and remembering Brower's notion that everything is environmental. There's nothing separated. Our air, our water, our ability to be, humans are just all environmental history we've got to think about in our environmental times. And so with the commons, it's just going to be to fight for public lands all the time. I don't make a whole lot of money as a professor. I do okay. But I know my kids are going to inherit these public lands, that they're going to get to go to these great places. But the climate change thing is very bothersome, The Joshua trees might be dead in Joshua Tree National Park. It's burning, I mean, the challenge is, I think, is to make these a university, which you are, University of California system in general, is you guys are leading the environmental movement out here. They're not leading it out of Washington in that way. So the ideas that you're coming for, ideas of tomorrow, how to attack climate issues and how to save more public lands, I mean, this is his laboratory here for ideas for tomorrow to come out of. Look how architecture's changed. You have environmentally sound architecture beginning now in places. In my city, today I just read Austin's becoming one of the great green cities, but it's important to have green grids. University of Hawaii, I just learned yesterday, is starting to do all solar at the University of Hawaii, a complete solar university it will be soon. These are exciting possibilities, meaning I don't think we just do public lands and sequester them off and that's it. It's about how do we build a world that we want to live in, and how do we save wilderness and wild places as heirlooms.
Yeah, so
President Napolitano.
It's to network and integrate. As many people here know, we have a goal for the university to be, as a system, carbon neutral by 2025, as the entire system. We'd be the first university system in the world to achieve that goal. That's a lot of architecture and materials and design and energy efficiency and new technologies and all the rest. Again, you see how these things relate, and it's interesting listening to you talk, Doug, about the different sites of parks. There's the wilderness experience, which is a subset of the actual outdoor experience, and then there's the whole park ecosystem, which is a much more varied set of experiences. So, and I think the notion of having absolutely untouched lands, wilderness lands, that's something we're really going to have to fight to sustain.
Yeah, Sally Jewell.
Yeah, do you mind if I add something? There's a saying that I'm fond of, which is it's hard to let go of the from if you don't know what the to is. And I think that if we're going to move from, I'm protecting the from because this is what I know. My granddaddy was a coal miner, my daddy was a coal miner, I'm a coal miner, I want my son to be a coal miner, but the world has changed. We understand that it's different. How do you paint a picture where somebody sees hope for themselves and for their community? And I would say that I've just, in this job, seen so many really heartening examples of people that were on opposite sides of issues and talking past each other. I still witness this sometimes in my hearings on Capitol Hill, but nonetheless, They talk past each other until they kind of get to a breaking point. And I would say this is happening right now in California around drought and lack of water, and a real need to examine the situation here and stop talking past each other and start cooperating. Because I'll have a group of members of Congress from one part of the state pulling me in one direction, and a group of members of Congress from the other part of the state pulling me in the other direction. It's nonpartisan, it's north and south. I said, instead of me just being in the middle, feeling like I'm being drawn and quartered by two different camps, maybe we ought to get all the camps together and talk about the very, very real issue that California is facing around drought right now. And I think that necessity is the mother of invention. I've seen a number of examples. Klamath, I know it's Oregon, bit of California in there, but the whole Klamath Basin is a region that had really very close to bloodshed over water, and a very complicated negotiation has been going on now really since that breaking point. And we're at the point where we have agreement and just need some things to fall into place with Congress. We're doing a major effort across the 11 states in the West, 7 kind of core states, on preserving the sagebrush steppe ecosystem. Supports 350 different species. It's old growth. Think of old growth being redwoods and Olympic National Park, and they are. But this is old growth, 150-year-old sagebrush stands, which are really critical to species, and we didn't understand that. And wildfire can wipe out 600,000 acres in the space of a few days. So for the first time ever, really 11 states are getting together, working across federal lands, private lands, state lands. In fact, that's where I'm going tomorrow, is to Eastern Oregon to celebrate an agreement with private landowners, the state of Oregon, the BLM and the Fish and Wildlife Service for really thoughtful preservation of ecosystems in a time when you never would have had people sitting down at the table together. And there's an Oregon rancher who said, and this is in the context of the greater sage-grouse, which is a species that that is a candidate for listing under the Endangered Species Act that we're working hard to protect. And the Oregon rancher said, "I've learned that what's good for the bird is good for the herd." Right? It's very clever. But I have seen in examples of drought and examples of sage steppe ecosystems and in other places around the country that when you actually sit down together in a room, that whole phrase, where you stand depends on where you sit. If you sit down together in a room and you understand the other person's point of view and you don't just talk past each other, you actually have an opportunity to do something that's for the good of the commons, as opposed to me versus you, north versus south, agriculture versus municipal.
I must confess, I've done programs with people in Holland and the Netherlands where they sit down and talk about environmental issues with all interested parties, and all parties are affected, including business and commerce, and they're able to hammer things out. That's how ideally we can do things and actually get things accomplished. But in this state, you've got so many different interests for water, and water is getting, as you suggest, it's actually pretty grim. So much goes to agriculture, and so their interests are sort of disproportionate to everyone else's.
But there's another area in terms of bringing private, public, state, federal together, and that's the whole issue of fire and the evolution of fire in the country. And what used to be a 5,000 acre fire now is a 50,000, and what was a 50,000 acre fire now is a 500,000 acre fire. That whole evolution of the issue of fire and how that by necessity is forcing disparate interests to be around the same table. Sometimes crisis does mold that sort of activity.
That's right.
I want to get another question to you, Secretary, if I may, from someone in the audience. You've addressed bringing young people and the initiative and so forth, but this is a question I'd like to hear what you have to say to. How do we effectively engage all people in the national park idea, and what sort of solutions can effectively address that most visitors, presume adults here, of the national park are white?
Oh, I think it's a huge issue. Major demographic shifts going on in this country, and our park visitors are not reflective of that demographic at all. They're older, they're whiter, they're more affluent than the population generally. Yeah. And if we do not make the parks relevant and welcoming to the fastest growing segments of this population, the urban segments of this population, the Latino, Asian, African American, women. I mean, there's a lot of disproportionality in our national park assets, and we're not going to change that if we don't make our parks more relevant to new generations. So Doug did a wonderful job of rattling off some of President Obama's national monument designations. Another one that he named at the same time when he was at Pullman was Honouliuli National Monument. That is an internment site in Hawaii, quite close actually to Pearl Harbor, where Japanese Americans were segregated into certain selective ones were pulled apart from the community because 50% of the population of Hawaii was Japanese. They couldn't intern half the population, so they were selective and shamed an entire generation really of leaders within that community and suggested they were traitors. That park was basically overgrown and forgotten to memory until a researcher from a university started poking around in 1998, and it was found in 2002. And now it will tell a very, very important story of World War II and of really the cultural choice to be assimilated within the Japanese American community because of the shame of being segregated during the war. This will make the parks relevant to communities that identify with that story. The Cesar Chavez National Monument will make the national parks relevant to a community of people that may have ancestors that were farm workers. These are really important stories to tell. We have launched a theme study for the LGBT community. Stonewall in New York was where we made the announcement. There are significant segments of our country where the stories have not been told. And the National Park Service is America's storyteller. Yeah. And I would say that, and I go to lots of national parks, some announced, a lot of them not announced, I just drop in, and I know I scare them.
See the ranger. Oh.
Yeah. Usually we just do selfies. But when you've got a interpretive sign and it's old, it's kind of embarrassing sometimes what's on that sign. I went to the Whitman Mission in outside of Whitman because I was doing the commencement address there last year at Walla Walla, Washington, and they had, actually the young park rangers had used MP3s to kind of voice over what should be said about the interaction between the Native Americans and the Whitman family, because the Whitman family was massacred by Native Americans, but it's because the Native American community thought they were being poisoned by these missionaries with smallpox. And it was a misunderstanding, but a very, you could put yourself in your situation and really understand that. And that was not being effectively interpreted. It was sort of good versus bad, and that was, 2014. So we have work to do. John Jarvis has been a leader in making this happen for the parks. The National Park Centennial, the fundraising that we're doing with the National Park Foundation will help accelerate that, and it'll use technology so you don't have to keep those signs up to date. You actually can geotag on your phone and it can tell you a current story. Maybe it can tell you multiple sides so that people can see themselves in our parks. And it's not just Doug's family and my family and maybe Janet's family.
See themselves in, as you say, their stories.
Their stories, yeah. These are their parks, exactly.
Janet Napolitano, specific question about partnerships. What partnerships exist or can we create between UC campuses and national parks to bring more youth into the parks?
Well, I mentioned the one we have with Yosemite, and I think that's actually a good model for undergraduates and a particular national park. We have all kinds of research partnerships, undergraduate, graduate, in all kinds of fields. And I suspect in the audience today are people who are involved in many of those research projects. But another area, and what I've been thinking of as we've been talking tonight, is because we have cooperative extension, and we're running 4-H and other similar type programs through every county of California, and it's not just rural. It's some of the most urban areas of California. Maybe there's a way through those activities to use our capability to get more of those kids outside and into the park, and maybe sometimes their parents can come too. And bring them together. And maybe the Secretary of the Interior would waive the entry fee to the park. So we could go. Wouldn't that be great?
That could be arranged.
Well, I brought up, and certainly didn't intend to suggest that there was mutual exclusivity between technology and poetry, but someone in the audience wants to know, what do you think is the role and opportunity of technology in connecting people with the outdoors?
Oh, it's huge.
Okay. You know who speaks for the land? The Secretary of the Interior speaks for the land. Sally Jewell?
The public speaks for the land.
Well,
And I appreciate being a public servant, serving the public. It's very
that
very
is her
important.
role. That is her role.
It's a privilege. So technology has to be part of the solution. I mean, I think there is the statistic, I think I rattled it off, kids spend 56 hours a week in front of a screen, only 30 minutes a week in unstructured outside play. But technology can actually be used as an enabler. I mentioned the idea of your phone knowing where you are and giving you, information about that site, whether it's what's the mountain in the distance, what's the tree right in front of you, what's the diversity of the species there, what's the history of this site, perhaps in the voice of the people that lived that history, as I saw with the Rosies today at Rosie the Riveter. I also think that things like BioBlitz. In my old day job at REI, I actually went and met with the leaders and developers of a number of the most popular video games in this country, and I said, you are so good at addicting us to wanting to go to the next level, the next level, and the next level. And I actually asked all of them about whether they had kids and whether they restricted their screen time and whether they let them play outside. They all had kids, they all restricted their screen time, and all the kids loved playing outside. And I said, that is not true for many of the people that buy your product. And could you do something that actually would engage kids, like a game that would be competitive on plant and animal identification of species in nature, kind of like the Audubon bird list. Don't ever get in the way of a birder that's trying to get that last bird. But I mean, it's very competitive. Could we do that for kids? And could that data feed not just go to the game to see if you were beating your buddy by finding different species, but also to a biodiversity database that would say, gosh, the African killer bee is now migrating up this way. Or particular plant or animals that are invasives are there. Or maybe you even go out on a kill the invaders patrol and pull the invasive species as you're out playing a game. So I think technology, we have it in our pockets. It's essential part of who we are. I think we need to embrace it, and we need to find a way to turn it to our advantage. And realize when a kid is on a device, it's not necessarily playing a video game. It may be actually texting the really cool place they just saw in a national park to their friend.
When I said you speak for the land, and you so appropriately and eloquently said it's a privilege to serve the public and the citizens, I couldn't help thinking, and there may be some people here who don't have the memories, the historical memories, and Joel, I'm going to defer to you here. You said that this is the best Secretary of the Interior we had, and somehow the name James Watt came into my consciousness. Could we give a little history lesson, perhaps?
Well, the Department of Interior is created in 1849 when James K. Polk was on his way out. But there have been, I think the great Interior Secretary was Harold Ickes, who worked with Franklin Roosevelt, because he was Interior Secretary from 33 all the way to 45. And was also a very believer in if you're a preservationist of wild places, Ickes, who was from Chicago, really threw himself into that arena in miraculous ways. Then Stuart Udall, during the Kennedy and Johnson era, is another just outstanding Interior Secretary. And I'm not pandering, but I'm very bullish on what Sally Jewell's been able to do with President Obama on a number of issues. And Ken Salazar before you, this term urban wilderness is starting to come in. It's with Ken and now yourself, but the idea of how do we do like Golden Gate National Recreation Area is a model for a lot of places that are people trying to find ways to find urban scapes, but at least have a nature component in it. On the technology front, it'll be Thoreau's 200th birthday in 2017. And Thoreau also kept journals that people now in Massachusetts are looking at his climate data, actually. And your idea, I think, is remarkable to have young people, if we could ever get school kids to start feeling their bird count or their insect count or anything could start mattering, would be a wonderful thing of a naturalist approach to the world age of technology. And also I worry about technology some, because technology comes in a lot of guises. I was a big admirer of Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire and the concerns that he had, which he did in an exaggerated way, but they also stick with me sometimes. Why are we building that highway? Do we need that dam? Do we need to be doing all of and how do we learn to say no to some things? So I was very strong about not wanting drilling in the Arctic in our Arctic National Wildlife Refuge with Franklin, which Dwight Eisenhower created in 1960, ANWR they call it. Beautiful, stunning place, went camping up there and all. So here we're lobbying and pushing, and just a few weeks ago, President Obama and Secretary Jewell have preserved, are pushing right now for it to stay a wilderness and stay pristine and along coast areas. So, and because some places shouldn't be. Some places shouldn't be developed, and the more I find that having these wilderness cushions, not just the national parks and monument, but wilderness areas, is essential to sanity in America. And even if you don't go to the wilderness areas, knowing they're there, and we haven't yet commoditized what is solitude. It's priceless, and we need to be able to at least know that there are places we can go to get away from the racket we're making in the modern world.
Thank you, Doug. And my apologies for calling you Joel.
No.
There was a weatherman on Channel 7 named Joel Brinkley. One final question, and we've been talking about preserving, and especially Secretary Jewell was talking about preserving for ethnicities and making the parks more amenable to people who don't have means and so forth. This is a question about indigenous Americans. California is home to more Native American tribes than any other state but Alaska. Is there any attempt to reconcile Native Americans to the public lands, especially national parks, which were often their homelands?
Short answer is yes, absolutely, and I think it is very, very important. California has many tribes, really now small rancherias. I mean, as I go across the country and Indian Affairs is part of the Department of the Interior, I feel the hurt of many of the California tribes. Whether they're recognized or not recognized, they're tiny, and their political clout is very limited, and they feel that acutely. When I come out and meet with communities around potential monument designations, as I did a couple of months ago in the Lake Berryessa Snow Mountain region. I met with a group of tribal leaders, some federally recognized tribes, some not. I think that our indigenous people have a tremendous amount to offer to all of the stewards of public lands. I think the traditional ecological knowledge is an important step in that direction. We are funding through the USGS, actually, a number of, I can't remember if it's 6 or 7 positions that are working on the science of traditional ecological knowledge coming together with modern science, if you will, to help us understand what's happening in these ecosystems. I was up in Kotzebue in northwest Alaska, and we have the number of they're very large, but sparsely visited national park sites like Cape Krusenstern National Monument, but we also have Selawik Wildlife Refuge. And they are working, both of them, very closely with the children in those schools in the area to actually get out on the land. And it's sort of interesting. They try and get permission slips and parents, and nobody signs up, and then somebody, word of mouth, somebody gets on a radio, and then all of a sudden they've got 60 kids. And they love it. And they're doing camps and outings and so on. So I would say that we are turning a new leaf in our public land management organizations to connect more closely with indigenous people. And we've got a rule that's about to come out for the National Park Service to allow traditional collection of plants and plant parts, which is very, very important to a lot of tribes.
I think that was a great last question, and thank you very
I'm afraid
much.
we have come to the end of the time we have allotted. How many of you found this evening really elevated your spirit optimistically? And good. I want to extend special thanks to Doug Brinkley, to President Napolitano, to Secretary Jewell, and to you, our audience. Much appreciated. Thank you.